How's it going, everybody? We are back with another episode of the podcast, and I'm really excited to bring you guys this one because I get to sit down with Kedric Kwan. Kedric is a nutrition coach and a powerlifting coach from Performance. He's also a PhD candidate based out of New Zealand. And in this episode, we get to talk a lot about kind of the unturned stones of nutrition for powerlifters. And we actually get to have a pretty nuanced conversation on how simple hitting your nutrition goals can be as a powerlifter. You know, it's not all of this crazy stuff that we have to track, a crazy amount of variables with. It really just comes down to eating enough calories, making sure you're getting enough protein in, and actually we have a pretty cool conversation about how you can gamify your own nutrition for your nutrition goals. So throughout this episode, like I said, you'll be getting a lot of keys, but before we start, I do want to talk about something else regarding nutrition, with that being supplementation. Now, of course, you guys know that I am paired with 110% with Kevin Papa, the owner of 110%. I'm forever grateful for the things that he's done for Escalate and for myself, and allowing me to be supported by him both through the podcast and through myself as an athlete. Now, if you guys haven't tried out 110% pre-workout, I highly suggest you doing so. It's more than just a pre-workout. It's a message and a community, and one that I'm extremely proud to be a part of. So if you haven't tried any of their supplements, I highly suggest clicking the link in the bio. My personal favorites are their focus and their sleep outside of their pre-workout. And right now, you can use code ROB for 10% off of your cart at checkout. Also, I have just wrapped up a couple of intake calls for the month of March, and I am pretty much capped on clients for the month of March. But if you do want to reach out to me and see what it might look like working with me for powerlifting coaching or lifestyle coaching in the month of April, I would love to hear from you guys. Down below is a link to both the inquiry form that I use as well as a link to my Instagram page. You guys can use both to reach out to me to inquire about coaching. I would love to hear a little bit more about your goals, and I'm sure that you guys would like to hear a little bit about how my coaching style is. So without further ado, with that being said, we will head into what is now episode 21 of the Escalate podcast. All right, Kedric, thank you for joining me. I want to ask you a quick question. What do you think is some of the lowest hanging fruit that powerlifters can start taking advantage of regarding their nutrition to kind of enhance their training or enhance their recovery and get stronger in general?
Yeah, thanks, Rob, for having me on. And I think if people are kind of like expecting a really like specific thing to do, I think they might be disappointed. I view nutrition from a very like a meta perspective. It's like kind of like what does nutrition consist of? And I often use I like to tell a story that let's just say a bunch of aliens come down to Earth, and then these aliens really hate powerlifting. And then the aliens say that whoever powerlifts, right, we just blast a laser to your head and like incinerate the powerlifters. So I can tell someone that, cool, you can actually stop powerlifting and you'll probably be fine. But then when it comes to nutrition, I said you probably cannot stop eating, because after a while, you just die, And that shows how like nutrition is just integrated into our lives as a whole, compared to when you look at powerlifting as like an exercise or hobby or competitive endeavor, right? So I think that the lowest hanging fruit I would tell anyone is that actually learn how to cook something that's delicious, like knowing how to like picking up cooking as a skill, right? Whether you're male or female, how old you are, I think you college student or not, or whether you're like 50, I think that learning how to cook is quite paramount for successful nutrition. Just primarily from the perspective of, if you know how to cook, one, you might be able to save a ton of money, right? Second is that you would probably be able to control. There are some odd individuals out there that don't like food, right? And they can eat bland food, but you can control the energy intake that you are consuming while managing the taste, right? So like things like, making food flavorful without adding additional calories, or on the flip side as well, if you are struggling to eat, you may be able to make something tastier while increasing the calorie content, right? So that those are things that I think can be very, very important for long-term nutrition success. And not to mention, if you want to impress a date or impress your in-laws or whoever, right? Cooking is always a helpful skill. So I don't think that anyone would say that cooking is a bad skill to have. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. I'm going to be honest, that's not where I thought you were going to go. It's so simple, but it's so powerful at the same time, right? If you know how to cook things that you like and they're generally healthy and they allow you to hit the certain nutrient goals that you set for yourself, regarding your strength training, then guess what? You're probably going to be a little bit more successful to do that, right? Because like you said, it's cheaper.
100%.
It's cheaper. You're going to have a little bit of fun with it. I know I love to cook, so like I'm right there with you. I love putting together a meal. And you're able to know exactly what's going into it. And I think it's very funny when I see kind of younger powerlifters, or maybe in that kind of junior age, right? That 20 to 23-year-old powerlifter. And they are so obsessed with their variables, right? If you talk to any junior powerlifter or sub-junior powerlifter, it's all about the variables. It's all about if you got on the next, the right amount of steps or got the amount of sleep. And they're very fine-tuning that. But I think a lot of them slip up on the one variable of knowing what is going into your body. And they'll eat out all the time. And you're looking at them and you're like, dude, like if you want to control all of your variables, if this is something that's important to you, if you learn how to cook, you are going to inherently be able to, I guess, control everything at that point, right? I don't know if you have any like different perspective on that, but it's very funny how people won't do that and then expect everything to, kind of fall in line as long as they're doing all these other things, right?
Yeah. I mean, conceptually, the way I view things would be, like a lot of these lifestyle factors are very like multiplicative, right? So I think that there's like kind of like a concept where it's like, are things like additive, right? Or is it multiplicative, right? So additive means like, 1 + 1 = 2, right? Whereas, multiplicative, 2 × 2 is 4, right? I mean, 2 × 2 is 4, but 2 + 2 is equal to 4. So probably not the best example. So 2 × 5 is 10.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So it's like the more you stack up multiplicative elements, right, the returns are slightly more exponential than additive. And I think that lifestyle related elements are multiplicative rather than additive, because like if you get your steps, like for example, let's look at activity level, right? That is a lifestyle thing, right? You walk around, you get those things without consciously doing it, right? So you may say like, you get your step count in, right? That's one thing, right? Sleep, that's also another thing that is multiplicative. You cannot not sleep for X amount of time, right? You can go only to a certain length of massively depriving yourself on sleep. And then you have like eating, right? That is also like say multiplicative because like say you can only go such a short period of time without eating, right? And if you can get all those elements like stacked up together, the returns may be more exponential. Whereas if you look at like caffeine intake, that is probably more additive, right? Like if you actually like have like a caffeine pill or something to enhance your performance or give you a slight boost, right? It is a very short-term thing, and it's not like you don't get it exponentially, because like the more caffeine intake you take, it's not like you would expect greater returns, because after a certain addition to what you're already having, right, the returns would just stop there, So I like to look at all these like lifestyle elements, right, things like that as having to place a bigger priority, because I think, at least in my opinion, right, they are multiplicative in nature, which means the returns are greater, especially when you can stack them up, right? So also because, like you said, how do we judge whether something is, how do you put a weight on each thing? Is sleep more important than eating, right? Or is eating more important than getting X amount of steps, or vice versa, right? So it's actually very hard to sort of like discriminate between these lifestyle elements, right? And therefore, that if you can get all of them like stacked up quite well, right, I would say that the probability of you getting larger returns on whatever you're doing is much higher, right? Compared to if you just be like, oh, we know that, okay, cool, like research has shown there's a dose response to caffeine, right? Cool, if you're eating, so if you have this amount of caffeine, you probably expect this impact, right? But lifestyle elements are very, very hard to actually pin down. But the good thing about that is also because things are very hard to pin down, it means that the flexibility and the room for error is actually the range of positive effects actually wider. It's not like if you cook 7 meals, cook 7 meals a week, right? You get an impact. But if you suddenly 1 week you can only cook 6 meals, right? Then that impact's not going to diminish because there's like no like, at least not to my knowledge, there's no dose response or study looking at X amount of home cooked meals you have a week and then showing a dose response in that, right? So the lifestyle elements are actually very much wider, right? So if you can get your habits just to intersect with the potential range that's beneficial, that itself can be a good, you can start reaping the results. And I'm a big believer of, people like, I'm a big believer of like motivation at being the primary driver as something that's very overrated, right? I think that people are motivated by results. People are motivated when they start seeing a positive outcome, and then they latch on to that positive outcome, and that drives them further. But to derive that positive outcome, you might have to put in a little bit more effort and discipline at the start, right? I know that some people do not enjoy cooking. You enjoy cooking, I enjoy cooking, and it might be my bias of me personally enjoying cooking that is making me say cooking is the low-hanging fruit people can adopt. But the fact of the matter is that if you don't like cooking, right, sometimes you just have to, suck it up. But once you start reaping the benefits of it, right, then you'll be like, okay, cool, now I'm reaping a positive benefit that I can see. Then that motivates me to cook more because now I'm actually deriving something that's helping me in my performance or whatnot. But then we kind of like go deeper into, a deeper rabbit hole on why people tend to adhere to nutrition less is because nutrition interventions that actually work tend to accumulate over a slightly moderate to longer period of time rather than, and I always say that there is no like immediate feedback loop when you do nutrition. Most supplements out there that work, you don't actually see a positive benefit after X amount of time. Even like creatine, even if you're loading creatine, you see it in 14 days, and that's taking like freaking 20 grams of creatine every day for 14 days, like the only thing that gives you a slight boost, right, that's at least legal, right, is caffeine, right? But that is just it's more of like it acts on your brain, right? But even the positive impact of caffeine, you don't really see it until you fingers crossed your caffeine gives you good training sessions and then you accumulate the gains. But when it comes to nutrition, other than caffeine, I don't see like a very like immediate like feedback loop, right, which makes people adherence to certain habits harder, right? And that's why a lot of people like, it's hard for people to do something that they don't like compared to, let's just assume there's no such thing as caffeine pills, there's no caffeine supplements, right? The only caffeine source in the world is coffee. And we know that there's a subset of people who are in this world who are atrocious, that don't like coffee, right? They just have really bad taste. But if they, for example, if they drink coffee and they feel that immediate like, oh, I feel like hype, even though they don't like coffee, they may still drink it for like that pumped, getting that pumped up feeling, right? Mm-hmm. But whereas when you do like cooking, like when are you gonna see that benefit? Probably down the road, and therefore it's harder for them to do something that they don't like when they don't see the immediate benefit. And yeah, maybe that's just how like the current society is wired with like Amazon and social media and whatever instant gratification, blah blah blah, which I don't want to dive too much into. But yeah, that's kind of like my thoughts around why I think cooking is important, why I think it's a skill to pick up. And like I said, it's also like riding a bike. Once you learn how to cook, you probably won't lose the skill, that cooking skill, unless you lose your limbs.
Yeah.
Right. So
or part of your brain, right? If you have some sort of neurological disorder, you might lose, you might become hemiparetic or anything. I really, really loved your explanation of it being multiplicative, and then diving into, obviously kind of this motivational factor of clients not seeing an immediate response. In training, especially for newer lifters, in training, it's quick. You start to, you get your first pump, and then maybe 2 weeks later, you start to see maybe a little bit more muscle mass, or if you're a powerlifter, newbie gains start to happen where, within a block or two, you are, hitting PRs almost every single week 4, week 5, end of the mesocycle. But for nutrition, like you said, it's a longer term thing. It's something that might take people a little bit longer to adhere to because they don't see those just immediate results. Yeah, maybe after 8 to 12 weeks of dieting, they might start to see a little bit more leanness in their body composition. but it's not like you're going to wake up one day and then all of a sudden you've got a six pack. And with the motivation stuff, something that I love to do, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this or potentially other avenues of getting clients motivated and getting clients in the mindset of, okay, this is something that's important. This is something that I need to adhere to. And what I do is I generally gamify it. So I generally create goals in kind of a game situation where it's like, hey, we're going to kind of level up here, right? First level is we're going to hit a protein goal, right? And for maybe we have 180, pound or around, 80 kilo individual, you might be like, all right, we're going to hit 180 grams of protein or even 170 grams of protein. That's level one. It's like, okay, you've done that. Now we're going to move on to level two. Okay, we're going to try and look at, carbohydrate timing before your session. Maybe that'll give you a little bit more, And I think by doing that and by setting out these kind of shorter term attainable goals where they can say, oh yeah, I've hit my protein on 25 of the last 30 days. Like that is a check. That hits my goal. Now I can move on to level two. I proved it to myself. It kind of creates that motivation a little bit better instead of just being like, oh yeah, I did this. When am I going to start seeing the results, right? I don't know if you have a certain take on that or if you have maybe other methods to help with client adherence or anything.
Yeah, I mean, like gamifying certain interventions it's the same thing as creating short-term feedback loops, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that, I mean, when we play games as well, like I'm a big Final Fantasy fan, right? You're like, okay, cool, Cloud, we have to fight Sephiroth right at the end, Oh, yeah. I'm like, oh my gosh, right? Like this is like so tedious, and then but sometimes like especially back in the day when you're playing on like PS1 and you you don't really have the internet, you can't go up and find like guides, you have to like buy like manuals which are like 30 USD, right? Like the walkthrough, now you can find all these gamers putting that thing on. So like you have to grind, like there are certain games out there that also requires like certain like grinding, like the game concept is grinding, but there's always something that in the middle that allows that positive like sort of like a feedback loop, whether it's a safe checkpoint or whether it's like a side quest that gets people like sticking towards the things, right? Like I remember playing Final Fantasy. One of my favorite things to do is from time to time is just like riding on the chocobo, right? Mm-hmm. And so happens like sometimes when you ride on a chocobo, you find like mythical weapons, like the ultimate weapon or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just not riding on a chocobo for fun. I mean, obviously some people would get a thrill just by looking at Cloud riding on a chocobo because it looks cute or something like that, and obviously it's faster because you don't have to walk, right? But there is that element there where you can probably find this weapon, which you might not get, right? So I think that it's the same thing with nutrition, right? And the only thing for me is, I think as a coach, I don't profess to have I mean, especially when it comes to powerlifting nutrition, I don't, it's not, it's literally not rocket science, and it's a lot of it has to do with adherence. Powerlifting is a sport by nature, right? The energy demands are very, very simple. The movements, right? You have 9 attempts in a very like singular plane of motion. It's pretty simple, right? So a lot of the things that that in powerlifting is very adherence based. So the more you can kind of like create that short term positive feedback loop, right, the better it will be, right? So, and that is also something, like I said, would be very individual from lifter to lifter that I coach, because some people might already have adequate protein intake, but there would also be people who, for example, who wants to gain weight but are having too high of a protein intake, right? So it's not always, I need to eat more protein, because like, let's just say, great, you have a lot of like micronutrient dense food, right? High quality source of protein, but you're also consuming maybe like 50 grams more protein than you actually require, at least the bare minimum, right, to make some form of progress. But right now your goal is struggling to gain weight. And if you're telling me that you're full all the time, I'm probably like, okay, cool, let's maybe not, like for this 50 grams of protein, let's swap it out for carbohydrates, because 1 gram of protein is, have the same energy value as 1 gram of carbohydrate, right? So, but you can probably, it's easier probably to consume 50 grams of carbohydrate from juice, right? Just compared to protein shake, especially. So that is another way where you can be like, okay, cool, right? Your short-term goal is very different from another client that wants to lose weight and has very different, and has a lower protein intake. So it's just, as a coach, for me is like identifying what are those you said the low hanging fruit for this specific individual, and then letting them know that this is why I'm doing it, right? And this is what you should expect to see or feel. I think that you are kind of like anchoring them to have certain expectations. I think managing the expectation is also very, very important, because a lot of times, people always say, like, if you're not expecting anything, you won't be disappointed, right? So just don't have any expectations in life. To a certain extent, it's quite true when it comes to nutrition, right? If you're expecting to lose X amount of weight in X amount of time, and if you don't actually achieve that, right, then you may be disappointed, and that disappointment can actually impact your adherence, and you'd be like, woe is me, everything doesn't really matter anymore because, I can't even achieve this goal. But I think that if you can let your the people that I coach, let them know what the expectation should be, what is the acceptable range, that they can be in, right? It's not like, okay, I have to hit this weight to the decimal point, right? And I think like managing those expectations, challenging them, letting them know that nutrition really isn't being that specific in terms of the values. The only time when you have to be specific in powerlifting is when you weigh in, right? You just have to be under that weight class, right? And even then it's not that specific, because you can be 0.01 under the weight class, you can be 1 kilo under the weight class, right? That range is quite wide as well. So when it comes to nutrition, I think that managing expectations could also probably be another low-hanging fruit, right? And it goes back into the concept of like gamifying as well. It's like, if you play a game, like, what is your expectations of finishing this game? So now when you look at a lot of like newer games, I mean, let's say, for example, Fallout, right? When you play Fallout, there's always like side quests, right? And when you play the game, for example, if your main goal is to just finish the main storyline, right? When you finish the entire game, you might be your progress might just be 40%, because you like did not do any of the side quests, right? But if your expectations are in line with that, you are actually achieving 100% of the goals that you came out, that you set out to do. Even though from the outside view, it's like, how can you say you're done when you're barely halfway through, because it only shows 40%. And now like games have, especially more like open world type games, there's a lot of like side quests that you can do, which are not actually related to the main storyline, right? So I tend to be the person that I like older games, because I play for the story, right? So I tend not to do many of the side quests unless I get like a special weapon, right? So my progress is always around 40% when I finish a game, but my expectations are really well managed, right? So it's the same thing for nutrition, right? What do you expect to do? What are the expectations you should see when you reach this time point, and how flexible you can be with that. The only time you cannot be flexible, and it's non-negotiable, is you have to be under the weight class when you compete. Other than that, you're probably fine.
Yeah. No, dude, that's a great explanation. And I really loved your kind of tie-in there of, yeah, maybe you're only at 40%, but your goal was just 40%. So be proud of yourself, right? Like, give yourself some grace, and being able to manage expectations and kind of, I don't know, I like the term giving yourself some grace, and give yourself some grace to maybe falter at times, or be within a range, right? I guess the word I'm looking for is have a perspective on your goals, right? A certain perspective of, yeah, maybe you didn't do everything, but you got to the point, or if not further than you thought you were going to be, right? Maybe to finish the storyline of Fallout, it only requires 25%, but you got to 40, right?
Yep.
And so you have that perspective of, oh my gosh, I completed 15% more than I was capable of. I do want to ask, and this is more of like just a blanket statement question, because it popped in my mind as you were talking about protein intake. And I don't want to be the guy that's sitting here going, hey man, how much protein should I eat? Because I'm sure that you get that every day, all the time. But I know that you work with, or you've been on a couple papers with, you somewhat work with Dr. Eric Helms, correct?
Yep, he's my PhD supervisor.
Yeah, he's been such a pivotal person, especially in the world of strength training when it comes to nutrition. And I think people have started to adopt his kind of, I'll say, methodology a little bit more. I know that I personally have, where that kind of 0.8 grams per kilogram range just isn't what the norm is, right? A lot of people are in one, or yeah, I said 0.8 grams per pound, I guess it would be. Sorry, 1.5, 1.6 grams per kilogram. My fault.
Yep.
It'd be like 0.8 grams per pound, which for me, that would be like 160 grams. When in reality, from what I've learned from Dr. Helms and his books and what he's put out there, I'm more around like 200. And right now I'm around like 220 because I'm dieting. And so I want to increase that, one, for satiety, and two, because of what he's kind of shown with it being able to maintain skeletal muscle mass a little bit more.
Yep.
If you were to say, maybe we'll ask this in like a threefold question here. If you were to have an individual that was dieting, an individual that was at maintenance, and an individual that was in surplus, and I know it's going to be individual for everybody across the board, but we'll just say blanket person A, where would you have their protein be for each of those separate goals?
Yep. I think before I answer the question, I think we frame it in the concept of like powerlifting, right? Since that is
yeah, absolutely. It's in the concept of powerlifting. Yeah.
Yeah. Because like I said, Dr. Eric Helms is my PhD supervisor, and he is profoundly influential on the things that I do, right? And also, I'm sure anybody in the online fitness industry can speak about his impact. But a lot of his research initially done was geared towards the physique athlete, right? So I'm not saying that that is completely different, but just from a powerlifting perspective, and also understanding powerlifters and the way they actually operate, right, is very different. So first of all, like, I think a context is that you often see high level like bodybuilders, they tend to be slightly older, right? Because obviously bodybuilding is kind of like, to a certain extent, it's a subjective sport where the judges will look at how muscular you are, how dense your muscle are. So probabilistically, if you start training, you have a greater training age. For example, like if you're 50, you've been training for 15 years, right? Your weight might be the same, but your musculature, right, and the definition will be very different compared to somebody who is maybe only training for 5 years, right? And with a training age also probably means that if you can continue training for 15 years, it probably tells us that you, at least your career, right, is sufficient to support your bodybuilding habits. Because both, I think one similar thing between bodybuilding and powerlifting is that neither of those sport, right, pay you well, right? So it's not like it's not like the NBA or Formula One or whatnot, right? Which means that it's very unlikely that you will find somebody in the sub-junior or the junior range winning a bodybuilding competition, because the muscle maturity is not there, right? And the whole reason why I bring this up is because protein intake, especially in our current, maybe the past 2 to 3 years, we complain about the prices of eggs, right? Protein is not exactly the cheapest thing now, right, in the world. So my question I always ask first is, what can you actually afford, right? And what can you actually sustain? Because when it comes to protein intake, when you look at studies and all that kind, any study where you look at where muscle mass contributes to strength, right, it is slightly moderate to long term, right? And we know that accumulating muscle mass also happens at a slightly longer rate, right? So let's just assume that you're trying to be in a surplus, okay? For your muscle mass to contribute to strength, right, it probably, you need 6 months to a year. But if you can make your ideal protein intake to support your surplus for 3 weeks, and then the next couple of weeks you have to find yourself begging on the street, right, because like, oh yeah, give me money so I can buy a protein shake, that kind of stuff, it's probably not going to work, right? You need something that is sustainable over a longer period of time. So let's just assume all things being equal, right? You find something that is that you can work with, and something that your budget can support. I would say that I always look at it from the perspective of what is the room, sort of like what is the room for error that you have, okay? And if we look at it from an energy balance perspective, evolutionary muscle mass is not advantageous, because even though it doesn't really consume a higher amount of it doesn't really consume as much energy as people would say, like it doesn't really raise your metabolism, but accruing muscle mass requires it does require more energy compared to someone who does not have as much, right? So that's the reason why one of the reasons, at least not the main reason, that if you are not providing your body with enough energy intake, your body tends to get rid of the muscle first, right? So if you are in a surplus, right, the likelihood of you losing muscle is much lower, which means that things that you need to focus on that spares your muscle, whether that's protein intake or maybe having better sleep, right? There's research showing that people who tend to have poorer sleep also tend to have greater muscle loss when they are in a calorie deficit, for example, right? But if you are having a surplus, right, you're unlikely, you're not likely to lose as much muscle, right? Therefore, muscle sparing elements could probably be lower, right? So that immediately puts your protein intake. Now, I'm not saying don't consume enough protein or don't sleep well. I'm just saying that you have more room for error if you're actually in a calorie surplus rather than if you're not, right? So for like, I would probably say if I were to throw out a number, I would probably just, go with what you enjoy, right? And aim for roughly, I think 1.6 grams per kilo body weight as a bare minimum should be a safe bet. It's actually not as high as what people think, it's actually, and there are multiple ways to do it as well, if you are struggling to hit that target. And then if you go towards maintenance, I would probably say that one thing when it looks at maintenance as well, when we look at energy balance, it's not just about gaining muscle mass or not, right? So it's about your body's ability to recover. How do you feel subjectively going into your training sessions? If you're in a maintenance, you are probably not gonna, let's just say if you're in maintenance, you probably might feel less good compared to someone who's in a surplus, just subjectively, right? So in that sense, if you consume more protein and you keep other like carbohydrates and fat the same, right, your energy intake would be slightly your energy intake can be slightly higher in terms of the proportion to your other macronutrients. Then because like I said, the limiting factor is maintenance, right? So, but let's just say if you are consuming really high amounts of protein, right, and then your carbohydrate is not sufficient for you to get fuel, right? Maybe let's just say if you're consuming something ridiculous like 400 grams, 300 grams of protein and you're consuming 100 carbohydrates, so you probably want to know what is that level or that ratio that helps you be able to perform, right? So I think that, like I said, at maintenance, your protein intake would then be more skewed towards how you feel subjectively, because let's just assume that if you actually consume slightly higher amounts of protein, maybe you feel subjectively you feel more recovered, right? Maybe it's a placebo thing, right? And also because, like I said, your energy intake is lower than your surplus. So if you are consuming a surplus, maybe subjectively you just feel really good because you're eating more in general. But in maintenance, if you're pushing hard, maybe if you consume more protein, you feel a slight boost in terms of your recovery rate, whether it's a placebo or an actual impact, which probably isn't. But if you feel like maybe consuming 1.8 grams of protein, you feel subjectively better. There is no downside towards that. If you're not constrained by, like I said, budget or whatever, and then you just have to make sure that your carbohydrate intake is sufficient to fuel your training, and then you can just adjust accordingly, right? So I would probably say that, you can probably gear towards more like the 1.8 to 2 grams per kilo body weight, depending on how you feel, depending on what you like, and depending on how it fits your habits, and then when it comes to a calorie deficit, we go back towards the constraints, right? And like I said, if you are going to be losing muscle mass, then you want things to be your things that spare muscle, you want to put that on a higher throttle compared to in your surplus. So when you're trying to be in a deficit, right, you probably want to be consuming higher amounts of protein to increase the chances of sparing muscle mass. You probably want to be sleeping better as well because you want to be losing fat rather than muscle, right? So all the things that supposedly spare muscle should be ramped up if you're in a deficit, just because you're working with like much more limited room for error, right? So, and then we also look at the recent meta-analysis by I think Martin Ruffalo and Eric. They're saying that higher protein intakes allows slightly more muscle growth, right? And then if you use that conceptually, right, then you can also make a case that if you're in a deficit, probably you want to consume slightly higher amounts of protein as well. And I think that if you move up towards that 2.2 grams, so in America, it's like 1 gram per 1 pound per kilo body weight, right? sorry, what am I saying? 1 gram per pound.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. 1 gram per pound. Sorry, I don't know.
You're good. You're good. I'm trying to do metric for you. You're trying to do pure units for me. So I appreciate the appreciate the conversions there. Yeah, it's right around that like 1.2 grams per pound body weight.
And then, like I said, it also now the element of psychological elements comes into play as well, because essentially, like when we talk about placebo effects, that are also, those are basically like psychological benefits, right? A placebo effect is by definition something psychological, and then you also look into other subjective factors like hunger management, right? We do see that protein intake does help to a certain extent, right? But like I said, the emphasis also should not be just on protein intake, because we look, when people are consuming meals as a whole, when they have fiber, right? Higher protein intakes doesn't really promote satiety much. But like I said, there's no harm in doing so, especially if it's something that you enjoy. If you enjoy eating high amounts of protein, right, and your life sucks because you're in a deficit, eating a nice piece of steak, as long as you can fit in your macros, or maybe the way you do a sous vide reverse sear chicken breast that tastes really good and low calories, if that makes your day, it'll likely help you stick to your diet better, and that would ultimately help, right? So you have to factor that in as well, and hunger management, and all that kind of stuff. So I would say that at least collectively, from the physiological evidence, and those, and also the psychological element when it comes to eating, right? I think that if you are in a deficit, gearing towards a higher amount of leaning towards a higher amount of protein intake has more positives than negatives, with the assumption that you can stick to it and budget is not a constraint.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think as long as you're able to get the amount of carbohydrates in, get the amount of dietary fats in, to one, sustain energy through workouts, and two, with dietary fats, regulate hormones well, obviously. Going with an increased protein intake, I never see it as a net negative, right? I don't think it would ever really, or you have to go really, really high, in my opinion, to get to the point where it might become a negative, might have a negative impact on your training. So it's like you said, it's one of those things where it's like, if you want to do it, go up there. If you can afford it, go up there. But it looks like from what you explained that, if you're in a surplus, kind of that 1.6 gram per kilo. If you're in maintenance, 1.8-ish gram per kilo, and then if you're in a deficit, you kind of go up to 2, maybe 2.2 grams per kilo, just because of the skeletal muscle wasting or anything happening there. You did mention, though, in there, and I kind of hinted at it too, around ensuring that there is proper nutrition protocols or proper you're fueling for your training sessions well, right? We're putting all of this in the perspective of a powerlifter. And you actually published, your second author on a paper where you guys surveyed and absolutely looked at this. For those of you that want to look into that paper, I'll have it linked in the description. But the title of it is Fueling for and Recovering from Resistance Training, the Peri-Workout Nutrition Practices of Competitive Powerlifters. Now, if you want to dissect the title there a little bit, because I'm not sure everybody understands the terminology there, especially with the peri-workout stuff. And then maybe just talk about some of the big key findings that you guys saw. I know that I have a couple questions there too, but you might be able to bring in some perspectives that I didn't hit on yet.
Yeah, for sure. I think that first of all, the first author of the paper is Andrew King. So Andrew King is
yes,
also a student, Eric's PhD student as well, right? And he's also a nutrition coach for Reformance, which is the company that I co-founded, and I work for. I guess I work for myself. So yeah, he's a nutrition coach at our company as well. Excellent researcher, highly proficient in terms of like especially with data analysis, right? So he's the first author, and he graciously invited me on to be the second author, because I have like experience in the sort of like in the trenches, to put it that way, working with powerlifters. So it helps like providing perspective in interpreting the data. So the paper is the peri-workout nutrition practices of competitive powerlifters. Peri-workout simply means anything surrounding your training session, right? So from the like pre-training, during a training, and after training. So those three, we can, to simplify it, to simplify it, right, if you combine those three, those would be considered peri-workout, right? So anything before, during, or after would be considered sort of like peri-workout nutrition practices. This is also like we have another paper just looking at general practices as well, right? But yeah, basically we published 2 papers. So yeah, I think that one thing to keep in mind is that all these papers are surveys, right? So drawing causal inferences from survey papers, right, should we probably can't make such strong conclusions, right? It's just surveying the landscape and seeing what people attribute. So a lot of things that we may theorize, especially when if you do read the paper, is open access, right? One of the criteria that Andrew, Eric, and myself we discuss is that we want to put it. We publish in open access journals so people can read it, right? So if you just type Andrew King peri-workout powerlifting in Google, you should be able to find it. And essentially, what we what we found was, like I said, we look at competitive powerlifters, and the main findings for the papers was that competitive powerlifters, one, they don't really fast before their training, right? And they primarily emphasize carbohydrates pre and during training, right? Before training and during training. And a lot of powerlifters also reported paying attention to what they consume post-exercise, right? And they emphasize on protein-rich foods post-exercise. And people just say, like, the most common reason, like I said, this is also a survey, right? So we're not saying that because they did this, therefore that, right? But there are reasons that they gave on why they focus on post-exercise nutrition, emphasizing protein-rich foods is they say that it helps them with recovery, right? So I said that the psychological element drives nutrition as well, right? Why do they consume protein after they work out? Because they think it helps with recovery. And also looking at, and then they believe because of that, they can train better and it would help their training, right? And they also said that, maybe this would be the subgroup that are dieting. They said it helps them prevent reduce hunger signals and also help them retain more muscle mass, right? So those are the reasons they gave on why they focus on protein post training. Another finding that we found was supplements, right? Supplements play a big role in powerlifting, and competitive powerlifters do consume supplements before training, such as whether it's a pre-workout blend, whether it's some form of energy drink like Monster or Red Bull or Celsius, whatever, caffeine pills, and coffee, right? So some form of caffeine, right? Caffeine supplement pre-training, and yeah, that's basically all, right? And that was like kind of our findings. What you would typically expect if you yourself are a powerlifter, that's probably something that you would do, right? The only thing that I would say, like, to put it crudely, the science haters would say like the bros are right, but we've never denied that the bros could be right. We're just more trying to put it in. We're trying to say, okay, cool, what you're saying is not just bro-ish, but it's also supported by what the research shows. So that's kind of like a brief overview of the paper, right? If people and we also like look at subgroup analysis, like depending how competitive you are, with IPF points, right? IPF GL points, or higher GL points indicate you're more competitive. We also had subgroup analysis looking at males versus females, masters lifters versus not, so according to biological sex and also according to age groups as well. Those are the things that we actually look at in subgroup analysis. So yeah, it's a pretty easy to read paper, right? For most of the layperson. Andrew also put in a lot of effort generating really like beautiful figures and graph and charts. So if you don't like reading, you can just look at that figure and you should be able to pick up a thing or two. So I think that this is one of the really, really good papers in terms of powerlifting related nutrition. That there isn't really much out there to begin with, so maybe that's not a really high bar to cross. But in general, being in the field, I would say that a lot of nutrition papers, nutrition research is quite crappy, right? This is I like I said, Andrew places a very huge emphasis on data analysis, so it's a very, very sound paper, right, statistically, and then people should read it, and obviously look at Andrew doesn't really post much on social media because, PhD student life, I'm sure you know what that feels like, but his publication record is quite impressive. So if people want to continue like reading his work, you can just type his like name, Andrew King, in Google Scholar, and you find his work and some of the works I'm co-author with as well. And obviously we are working on other projects together as well, which fingers crossed once I'm done with my PhD should be published soon. So yeah, that's a brief overview and some plug for the scientific community out there.
Hell yeah, man. No, I really like the point that you make where it's like, yeah, okay, bros, you were right, but like, let's make sure that you're right before we say that you're right, because that's all we're trying to do here, right? There's been, kind of this shift. And sometimes I think it's a little cringy too, where it's like, science-based lifter, like, is it a lengthened partial or is it a shortened partial? Like, what is more important? It's like, all right, guys, I think just resistance training is important. Let's just leave it at that. But yeah, it's definitely just giving reinforcement to those thoughts that we kind of all have, right? All the bros knew, okay, you should probably have carbohydrates around your training session. Okay, let's actually do some analysis. Let's actually see if it works. And for those of you that don't know, he is absolutely correct when he talks about nutrition research being a little weird. I know I've tried to dive into it a little bit. Of course, I'm a neuroscience guy. And so whenever I start diving into nutrition research, it really breaks my brain because there's a lot of biological processes. There's a lot of acronyms that I have no idea what they mean. So I'm always like having to go back to an introduction or go back to a method section to figure stuff out. And the worst one is when you actually, kind of maybe get to the findings or get to the methods and you're like, wow, seems like a great topic. And then you realize, oh, this was in an animal model. Okay, let's take everything with a grain of salt here now, right? Because who knows if the mouse or the rabbit or the monkey, for a lot of the stuff that we do in neuroscience, actually makes sense and actually works in humans. It's different organisms. But I really, really like the subgroup analysis stuff that you guys did. It was really cool to look at that. And one of the biggest things that I kind of saw, I kind of have a couple points here, but there was a lot of differences between a junior lifter and an open or a master's lifter. One of them in just kind of eating before their sessions in general. I think that was one of the findings. I skimmed through the paper a little bit. Like I said, I looked at the figures. Like you said, Andrew did a great job with those figures. They're very, very easy to read. It's not always the case. But I did notice that there was kind of this difference between junior lifters and then open and masters lifters, where they didn't want to feel hungry going into the session, right? Juniors were a little bit more emphasized on that, whereas open and masters lifters weren't. I don't know if you have any further, thoughts on it, anything that you guys hinted on in the discussion that you think might be the reason why that happened.
Yeah. So once again, like I said, because of the nature of the paper, right? And when you publish in certain journals, you have like word limits as well. So we can't just write everything we want. We put the main points in. So there are certain things in subgroup analysis that we didn't cover. But the big thing is, a lot of these things Andrew and I discussed. So whatever I say here is approved at least by the first author of the paper. And I think the main thing is when we look at junior lifters as well, there is certain research out there that actually shows that there's a negative correlation in terms of age and neuroticism when it comes to athletes. So like you said, junior lifters or sub-junior lifters, they'll be like, oh yeah, I need to focus on this minute detail, right? So that subjective feeling, right? Not to discount it, not saying that it's not important, especially since there's also research out there showing that subjective hunger levels can actually impact training performance, right? So I'm not saying that it's junior lifters are completely out of pace, but I think when in general, by definition, if you are slightly older, right, and you've been training more, let's just say with greater training age, right? So I think we didn't really look at training age in this paper. We just classify them according to their age group. But let's just assume that if you're a master's lifter and you didn't start powerlifting when you turn 40 years old, right, you probably have been powerlifting for a slightly longer period of time. So you might probably have experienced more sessions being hungry and realize that the world doesn't end when you're not as hungry. So sometimes it doesn't really matter, and maybe like you said, there are things like that strength, for the people that I coach, for example, like Chow Beckerlin, who has two young children, and I'm like, yeah, cool, I don't have time to eat before because the only time I can train is like 5 a.m. before my kids wake up. So I have to train faster, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe I not even, okay, I mean, our research showed that powerlifters don't really train faster, but maybe I just have a quick protein shake and a banana. I'm not exactly full, right? Maybe I'm still a little bit hungry, right? But I still have to train because that's the only time I have. But, lo and behold, right? I think a lot of research have shown that if you're not doing something that's like absolutely suboptimal, your body does adapt towards it, right? It's more even with like training according to like the circadian patterns, right? Versus like evening training versus morning training. After a while, once you get used to training at a specific time, your body just adapts towards it. So I think that mentally, right, slightly more mature or experienced lifters in general, they tend to be less neurotic about being hungry because they know it's probably not the end of the world. Whereas like if we look at the research showing neuroticism and sort of like younger athletes in general, not just powerlifters, it tends to be slightly higher. So they maybe be like, oh yeah, let's get like really locked in with all this, and then that's probably why that is why I would say they are trying to emphasize on that subjective feeling.
Yeah, that's funny that you mentioned that. It kind of brings us full circle here from one of the first points that we made. And I completely agree. I mean, I was in that. Yeah, I'm a sample size N of 1 for that specific point of neuroticism very early on in my powerlifting career when I was 18, 19 years old. Man, you would have caught me dead if I didn't have a certain amount of caffeine and a certain amount of carbohydrates before my training session. Nowadays, as a PhD student, being in the sport for 8 to 9 years, dude, I'm just wanting to get to the gym, right? I'm just wanting to actually get there and enjoy myself and not have to think about what's going on in the lab or any emails that I might receive while I'm there. So I'm right there with you. It definitely does change. Definitely does change. Well, I appreciate you coming on, man. I think this is a perfect place to end it. I'm going to give you the opportunity to plug anything that you want to kind of hit on, whether that be your coaching with Reformance or any projects that people can be looking for coming up with your research, anything like that. I want to give you the opportunity to shout it out.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Hopefully what I've shared with your listeners would be beneficial. I think that the best way you can find me would be on Instagram, right, or on the Reformance training page, right. We post, when I say we, I mean Reformance, right, and obviously my business partner Alfred, who manages our social media, right. We post a lot of like infographics on our site, whether that's training or nutrition related. For nutrition coaching specifically, I personally am not I don't have any spots for nutrition clients because I've decided to not take any more clients until Worlds 2025, IPF Worlds 2025 is over, just because I'm also right at the tail end of completing my PhD. But Andrew King, who is, like I said, the lead author on the paper that we just mentioned, alongside many other papers, and personally, like I said, people should just read his meta-analysis and on carbohydrate intake, right? That's another really good paper. I think, like I said, because the nutrition research is so muddy, right? I think that is one of the best papers on carbohydrate consumption for resistance training in the past, past 10 years, So he is accepting clients, right? So if you are interested in doing nutrition coaching with Reformance, by all means, just send us an inquiry, right? Most likely, Andrew would be the one taking the client load on. And yeah, I think that's kind of all. I do have a couple of papers out there. I only have, I can't remember, one first author paper and a couple of second author papers out there. Currently I'm looking at completing up my thesis, and with that we should publish at least maybe 3 papers.
Sounds about right.
One of them, one of them we looked at basically gut cutting, right? Looking at the replicability, validity of gut cutting, right? Seeing if it's actually replicable across time, and seeing if there's any difference between males and females, right? Due to different gut motility and stuff like that between males and females. That's one of the papers that it's in the works. Another one would be looking at weight cutting and how that impact subjective like scores, right? So like I said, the subjective element plays a big role as well. So we look at weight cutting practices, how much weight you lose across different time points, and how does that impact your subjective scores, and looking at how does the subjective scores actually impact like competitive levels, like your good lift points. So that's another paper that is in the works. And then the last paper that I'm currently writing up now would be looking at dehydration from heat exposure. So sauna, hot tubs, right? What is the best time to do it? Should you do it the morning of the competition? Should you do it the night before? And what's the impact on performance? That is the final paper that that I'm currently working on and should be expected to publish. And I have obviously my literature review, which initially I didn't want to publish because it is not like a necessity to publish it to graduate. And because of the scarce nature of powerlifting specific research when it comes to weight cutting, I felt like there's not much to write about. But then I think that the narrative that I chose to take, basically trying to compare combat sports, right? Looking at combat sports, which weight cutting research is largely inspired by, and trying to compare that with the different bioenergetic demands, the physiological demands with powerlifting, and then seeing what we can use. That was the narrative I took, and after 10,000 words and going through it, and surprisingly, give Eric saying that it's a very good review, I may actually consider publishing it, but it's not high on the priority list. So those are the papers that would be out from my PhD, and those are the work. And if you want to listen to any of the other random podcasts, which apparently I should have a list that I've done in the past, I think you just type my name in Spotify, you should be able to find it. So just make sure you spell my name correctly, because if not, you spell it wrong, you probably find a black rapper rather than an Asian guy talking about science. So so that's where you can find me.
That's funny, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on. My dog just jumped on me. Sorry about that. He was kind of hanging out here back behind me. I'm not sure if you noticed, but I appreciate you coming on, man. This is really cool. I'm actually gonna look really forward to that gut cut paper, especially if it talks about obviously the repeatability of it, right? Is this an adaptation that happens if you continue to do it 2 to 3 times a year, right? I think that'd be really cool to find out. So I appreciate you doing that research, first of all. That's fantastic, dude. You're doing a service to all of us powerlifting coaches out here. And all of the links to, I'll actually probably link your Google Scholar. I'll probably link Andrew's Google Scholar in the description, and then I'll put a link for the paper and the Reformance website down there too. So for anybody that wants to check out anything that he talked about, please go ahead and check those out. If you've made it this far in the podcast, I really appreciate it. This was one of the longer episodes, but Kedric had some great discussion on some of the questions that I had. I think it's going to be beneficial for a lot of people. If you did enjoy it, I would really appreciate a follow and a rate on the episode. Helps us out tremendously trying to get this out to more people. And Kedric, thank you, man. This was awesome. I appreciate you.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you very much for having me.